I can't wait, because mine and Carmen Carrion's new book, Freaky Folklore, Terrifying Tales of the World's Most Elusive Monsters and Enigmatic Cryptids, is coming July 16th, featuring the history and lore of terrifying folklore creatures from across the globe, alongside some cool and creepy illustrations. Pre-order today on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your favorite bookstore, or go to eeriecast.com/freak. The next 1,000 verified pre-orders will get a Freaky Folklore decal and a 3-month subscription code to EerieCast Plus, and all entrants will get a free PDF sneak peek of the Freaky Folklore book. To verify and for more info, go to eeriecast.com/freak. When you think of Michigan, you think of Great Lakes and forests, and those of you around here probably think of the infamous Dogman. But oh, is there more to fear in the Great Lakes state than some upright walk-in puppy? Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you should follow me on Twitter because I've been really getting into baking lately, and my carrot muffins are to die for, and that's where I've been posting some recipes. Actually, today's episode was requested by a follower on Twitter who wanted some stories all about Michigan. So, here you are. Enjoy! Remember to send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. At the moment, I'm looking for solo camping stories. Also, for the love of the Dogman, you should be listening to this show, Unexplained Encounters, on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. It's a much better experience. Go to eeriecast.com/unexplained for links. Now, let's begin. Creepy Caller from Anonymous. I work in a police department in the small city of Frankenmuth, Michigan. I'm an assistant, usually just organizing various documents and grabbing drinks and whatnot for the operators. What I'm about to share with you is a series of events all related to a single mysterious phone number. Note, I wasn't present during any of this, but I corroborated details told to me by my coworkers. On May 15th, 2015, Frankenmuth Police Department received its first complaint about the number blank. Narrator's note: for the sake of anonymity and safety, I won't be saying the number. Apparently, this number texted someone at exactly 3 a.m., stating that their name was Sam, and they asked if the person they texted was a boy or girl. Frankenmuth PD got similar reports during the rest of May and early June. The reports did not escalate in severity, and the police department saw no reason to pursue the matter further. August 11th, 2015. This was the first violent report of the number. Apparently, the number had texted someone at 5:05 a.m. stating that their name was Sam, and if the person did not reply, they would, as the person nervously added, eat their dead hamster. Yes, you heard that right. Oddly enough, in the report submitted to the police department, the plaintiff stated that they did in fact have a dead pet hamster. It had passed only 3 days before. Come August 20th, the police department of Frankenmuth received another violent report of the same number. This time, the person attached a transcript of the text messages, received at 4:15 a.m. It went like this.
Please wake up. I can't hear you if you don't wake up.
Who is this?
This is Sam. Please wake up.
You must have the wrong number.
Your dog's gonna get it.
Excuse me? Who in the world is this? That was the end of the attached transcript. In the report, the plaintiff also described how the call abruptly ended as soon as she said that line. She had an appointment with the veterinarian that same day, and during the examination, they discovered a series of bizarre markings on the dog's underbelly, representing that of illegible writing. Due to the many reports and the distress of plaintiffs, Frankenmuth PD investigated. When looking up the number, the police department noted it belonged to the service provider Verizon and was not registered to anyone. After speaking with staff at the local Verizon retail outlet, The staff checked their computers, only to find the number was unregistered to any active SIM. Having no explanation for the eerie text messages or the alleged dog incident, the police department wrote off the complaints as prank text messages and ceased the investigation. September 4th, 2015. The final report of 2015 regarding the number. At 2:14 a.m., Frankenmuth Police Station received an emergency call from a woman. The following is a loose transcript of that call, given to me by a friend of mine working as the operator at the time. 911, what's your emergency?
There's someone banging on my door. They're screaming my name, wanting in my house.
Stay calm, ma'am. What's your name and address?
My name is... I live on... Please get here fast. They're getting louder.
Don't worry, ma'am. A patrol car will be there as soon as possible. Do you have any idea who the person is? A family member or a friend? An ex?
No one I know would be doing this. Before I heard the banging, I got a text message saying, I'm outside.
Did you recognize the number?
No, I've never seen it before.
All right, ma'am. Stay on the line. The police will be there very soon.
Oh my God. I think they've broke in. I think I heard the lock break.
Do you have anything in your house you can use to defend yourself?
No, get away from me!
Ma'am, is the person in the room with you? The line was disconnected. Exactly 4 minutes after the line disconnected, a Frankenmuth PD control car arrived at the scene. 2 police officers entered the house to discover the place was in extreme disarray. Tables had been upturned, glasses shattered, the TV smashed. The officers also found a cell phone with a shattered screen face down on the dining room table. It was noted this phone was the device used to call the police department. After a full search of the house and the surrounding 5-kilometer area, Frankenmuth Police Department was unable to find the woman who lived at the home, or any trace of the supposed assailant. After reviewing the call and text logs in the phone's storage, police confirmed that the number who texted the woman prior to her disappearance, saying, I'm outside, was the same troublesome number. On February 10, 2016, Frankenmuth PD received its final report regarding that number. The report was not violent and just consisted of a single text message, saying,
Happy anniversary.
The reason the plaintiff filed a report was because apparently he had received the message at 12:01 a.m. on the date of his wedding anniversary. But his wife had been dead for approximately 8 years at the time of that report. After the final report, Frankenmuth PD got a court order to have Verizon condemn the number. And that's the end of the story. Almost. Strangely enough, despite the number now having no service provider or registration, you can find on websites like WhoCallsMe.com new reports regarding a user named Sam and the very same phone number. Summer Goosebumps. From Anonymous. When I was younger, I used to live with my mom up in Michigan, and every summer I would come to stay with my father. I'm 18 years old now, but this was when I was around 6 or 7. I believe in spirits, ghosts, the supernatural, but I never really believed in most cryptids, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. However, it was during this summer that I began to believe in cryptids. My dad lived in Pike County at the time, and my brother and I had been to his home about 3 summers already. So we knew the area around the house relatively well. But we always got goosebumps whenever we walked around some of the empty homes nearby, or when we looked down at the creek. Even when I stopped going to stay with my dad for the summer, I always had the exact same feeling when I was up in Michigan. I still get that feeling to this day. One day, my older brother and I were walking past the old homes when he stopped me. He pointed something out, and I saw it too. A pair of red eyes in one of the windows. He decided it was a good idea to show me, his slightly paranoid little brother. When I looked, I saw nothing but the eyes. There was no head, no body, nothing. A few weeks after that, my brother and I were playing in the backyard, and what had happened with those red eyes had already slipped my mind. That is, until my brother and I got on the back porch. It was then that I saw it. This large brown thing was down by the creek. I knew it wasn't a person in an outfit or some ghillie suit because I had seen those before. Most of my family had been in the military. I motioned for my brother to come here and look. Immediately, he pointed out that the thing was holding a relatively sharp and straight stick in his hands. It was then that it looked at us, and we saw its crimson eyes. It knew we were watching it, and it crossed the 6-foot-wide creek in one single step. My brother and I quickly ran inside. We told my dad and stepmom, but they didn't believe us. Later, the next summer, I decided to stop coming down for the summer because of some misunderstandings and complications that I won't mention. But when I was 12, my mom and I went for a walk in a park in my hometown. It was the middle of summer at the time, about 95 degrees and absolutely beautiful outside, until I got a sick feeling in my stomach and goosebumps formed all over my arms. I stopped and I told my mom that something wasn't right. I explained that I felt like someone or something was watching us. The next day, there was a mangled and mutilated body found by park officials in a ditch just 10 feet from the trail we'd been walking on. I don't know if whatever it was that was watching us was the culprit, but I did know it was the same thing that killed the man who was found in the ditch, and I had a sick feeling that it was the same thing I saw in Kentucky. So far, the last time I had this feeling was during a Civil War reenactment at an old haunted battlefield. As I said, I've always believed in ghosts, but I knew something else was there. I had that same feeling that I had years before. I told my lieutenant and our den mother, but neither of them believed me. And to make matters even worse, it rained hard. We took shelter under the main tent that was the eating area. My lieutenant forgot something at his home, and he, along with the first sergeant, went to go get it. Meanwhile, our den mother went to sleep in her waterproof tent. Our tents weren't waterproof. As my friends tried to go to sleep, something didn't feel right. I felt like something was watching us, waiting. So I got up and I began to walk around the massive tent. The sides were lifted up to allow easy access. Two of my friends, who were extremely superstitious, like me, followed me around a little bit. It was at this point I felt the goosebumps, and when the lightning flashed, I saw it. The very same crimson eyes and the same imposing figure. I knew one of my friends saw it too. It disappeared by the next lightning flash. I haven't told anyone about these stories and the strange connections between each one. I don't think I'll ever be free of this thing, which seems to be following me throughout the years. The dead may be trying to tell you something. From FearMonger. I was a freshman in high school in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. I was sleeping over at my friend Jared's place. We were watching a movie in his living room when he suddenly got a phone call. I watched as he listened to what was being said on the other line. Then emotion poured over his face as he threw the phone across the room. After a moment of crying, he told me what the call was about. A boy at my school had killed himself. Now, I only knew this boy through seeing him in the hallways from time to time. My friend Jared and I didn't go to the same high school, but he had gone to middle school with this boy, and apparently Jared had bullied him during those years. He wasn't proud of it, and to be honest, I was pretty surprised because he was a great guy. Jared had utter remorse. We decided to sneak out and go for a walk. The year was roughly 2001. We snuck out frequently. At the time, we weren't into drugs, alcohol, or partying. We just liked the freedom of walking the streets at night. The discussions we had on those dark roads and paths were always great. Normally, we'd go walk through the big cemetery that was near my house. It was behind the train tracks that still run through Flint to this day. We loved the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery. It was a sort of rite of passage. As we walked along the train tracks, we stopped. To this day, I can't explain why. We'd walked into that cemetery dozens of times, and on even scarier nights than that. For whatever reason, we did not want to enter. I don't know if the thought of death on our minds, due to my classmates' death, was a factor. Perhaps it was. Regardless, without really saying anything to each other, we stopped, turned around, and decided to head down a nearby street. Now, in retrospect, I do have to say that throughout this walk, things seemed off. There wasn't a car in sight. This was suburbia. Even walking through the town's main street was odd, because there just weren't any cars. Very weird. It was roughly after midnight. It was a weekend night, though. Where was everyone? Perhaps it was just a strange coincidence. Lastly, there was something in the air. Both Jared and I felt it. We decided to walk down a dead-end street. At the end of the street was a ditch with a simple up, down, and up trail that led to the street I lived on. Simple enough. These weren't old, creepy houses with strange individuals. Rather, normal homes with normal people. And the trees were small. It wasn't a brand new development, but it wasn't that old either. So as Jared and I walked down the street, we were looking down at the road beneath our feet, talking. I don't recall the exact conversation at that moment, but it could just have easily been about Star Wars or Back to the Future. As we approached the dead end, which was a few houses away, Jared and I suddenly stopped. We did so at the same time, without saying one word to each other. Our heads slowly turned towards one another, both sensing something. The hair along our arms and the backs of our necks stood up high. Then our gaze slowly moved forward in unison, slightly to the right. That's when we saw it. About 2 houses away, in a virtually barren front yard of a suburban home, beside some bushes, was a red figure. It was someone or something in crimson red robes. No face, no features at all, just a robe. Now, this figure did not acknowledge us. Not yet. Instead, it walked or moved in a certain way. It was as if it was walking in circles slowly, without really walking. It held something that was blowing in the wind. Another odd element was the light that illuminated it somewhat. There was a streetlight a few houses up, but it was nowhere near strong enough to illuminate this figure as it was. Jared and I were frozen. There we stood, frozen in fear, staring at this dark figure moving, yet doing so without actually moving. And it was holding something. Perhaps what was blowing in the wind was more of its robe. I had no clue. We stared for what felt like decades until something changed in its movement. It looked up from its hypnotic state as if it was finally alarmed by our presence. That was enough for us. We ran away as quickly as we could. We cut through a side street that would lead us to a parallel street towards my neighborhood. This street led to a slight hill. As we rounded the corner and started to run up the hill in a panic, we stopped. Because on top of that hill, we saw another mystifying figure with its arms raised. We turned around and ran away in the direction of Jared's house, which at this distance was at least 5 miles away. The next thing I remember, we were lying in the middle of a courtyard of some other neighborhood that we had never been in, gasping for breath. We sat up and, without saying a word, walked in silence back to his house. We were out of danger then, sure. We fell asleep in his house, and I woke up that morning and went home. A few years ago, Jared died at his home in Flint, Michigan, 15 years to the day of that incident. Could it have been a warning all these years? Insomnia, from Texashell. I grew up in a small town in Michigan with my mom, dad, 2 sisters, and 3 brothers. Our home was very small, located on the corner of our street, with only 3 bedrooms and 1 bath. You can imagine how crowded it was, with 8 people living there. My parents had 1 bedroom that was in between the other 2. My 2 sisters and I shared the bedroom that faced the street. And on the other side of the house, the 3 boys shared the other, facing the next-door neighbor's house. The summer before I turned 9 years old, I was often unable to sleep due to a disturbing dream. It was on one such sleepless night that I witnessed some very strange things happening, involving one of my sisters, and on one occasion my youngest brother as well. It was very frustrating, being unable to sleep with my whole family sleeping already. At the time, the hallway light was turned off. There wasn't enough light to read or play with my toys, and it would wake my family if I were to go downstairs to the family room, turning on the TV. Usually I would just go through the day's events, or think about an upcoming family trip my parents had planned to take us on. That particular night, I found myself watching my sister as she slept. She was the prettiest of the girls and the second oldest, myself being the youngest girl. I tossed and turned a bit, and when I looked over at the bed next to mine, where my sister lay sleeping, but I found myself looking at 2 copies of my sister. One was her still sleeping body, and the other was her sitting up. I rubbed my eyes and blinked. I looked again, only to find things just as I'd seen them a moment ago. Her sleeping body lay on her back, looking like it always did. But her form that was sitting up seemed to resemble white snow. If you grew up in the 1960s, you'd be familiar with the term white snow. Back then, the television went off at 10 p.m., as there weren't any programs that went on later. There would be a test of the broadcast station, followed by the Star-Spangled Banner song. Then the screen would display a gray and white sparkly screen and a static noise until about 5 or 6 a.m. That sparkly screen was known as white snow. When I saw her lying there and sitting up at the same time, I pulled my covers over my head, terrified, until eventually I went to sleep. As it was summer, my siblings and I were off to find adventure as soon as we finished breakfast. Being only 8 years old, I didn't recall the previous night's frightening events until several nights later, when I once again witnessed my sister lying down and sitting up at the same time. This time I kept watching. I saw the white snow sitting up sister slowly lay back, blending together with the lying down sleeping sister. As before, I covered my head in fear and eventually went to sleep. This happened almost nightly for a few weeks. My fear of being ridiculed by my family kept me from saying anything. Right before school started, after an exhausting day of school clothes shopping with my mom and 2 younger brothers, I went to bed early and skipped supper. I fell asleep easily for the first time in months, but I would be awakened because I heard shouting and crying as my brothers had a squabble getting ready for bed. My dad went in and settled them down with a promise of spanks if they continued. I fell back to sleep with the sound of my youngest brother quietly crying. I woke up in the dead of night looking across at my sister's bed. She was sleeping peacefully. No white snow double tonight. Just as I started to lay back down, my eyes were drawn to the end of her bed. There I saw the figure of my youngest brother, and his form was now made up of white snow. It crouched at the end of her bed, hugging his knees, his head on his arms, rocking slowly back and forth as if comforting himself. I was never so glad as I was when my insomnia suddenly ended, and I no longer had to witness the disturbing sight of my sister and her double, or anyone else in our room whose form resembled white snow, like the television static when off the air. I often wonder if I had crept to the other side of the second floor of our home and peeked into my brother's room on that night when I saw his strange form at the end of my sister's bed. Would I have seen him peacefully sleeping in his own bed still? Has anyone else out there had an experience like this? The Visiting Ancestors in Two Haunted Houses. From When Ghosts Come Out. This story takes place all the way back in the 1980s. But the story's not mine. It's my dad's, my aunt's, and my grandmother's. The homes were located right next to each other, located down a quiet road in Michigan. But before they lived there, before my dad and my aunts were born, our own ancestors used to live in those homes. They even died there and were buried on the property. And before long, their descendants began to claim to see the spirits of their ancestors. One of the homes was an old double-wide house that had an old Michigan basement. The other house was an old farmhouse with an old red pole barn next to it. My grandma, dad, and my aunts lived in the double-wide house, and my great-grandparents lived in the farmhouse. Both these properties were known to be haunted. These two homes were built right next to each other, so they were neighbors. The farmhouse had an old gravel wraparound driveway that my dad would always ride his bike around when he was little. My first aunt would often go for walks behind the old houses, and my grandmother kept all her goodies in the basement. This is important for later in the story. My second aunt doesn't even believe in ghosts. She tries to deny anything that happens, but there's truly no explaining what happened over there. In total, there's said to be 5 people buried over there, behind the garage at the farmhouse. On days when my aunts used to go and visit my great-grandparents, over at the old farmhouse, they would often hear footsteps walking around upstairs. Suddenly, the silence would be broken by heavier footsteps walking all around upstairs, and they never went to go see, because they were simply too scared to go up there. They had no idea what they might find. One day when my dad was riding his bike around the gravel driveway, minding his own business, he suddenly looks up, glancing at one of the upstairs windows. That's when he sees this old woman staring down at him. He was told by family members that he didn't need to be scared. It was just his great-great-grandma. On another occasion when he was riding his bike, and he saw the same old woman again, a person he didn't recognize, and nobody should have been up there. On another occasion, my aunt was bored one day, so she started to take her usual walk on the old gravel trail behind the houses. She was a few minutes into her walk when suddenly she began to feel this strong sensation that someone was staring at her. She looked around, then behind herself, and in one of the houses she saw one of the window curtains getting pulled shut, as if someone had been watching her and didn't want her to see. But she clearly saw the window curtains get jerked shut. Creeped out, she ran back to the house. But there was no trace of anyone up there. Now on to the big red pole barn next to the old farmhouse. When my dad's uncle would be working in that barn, he would often see these tall figures standing in the wooden barn rafters. When he looked closer, he recognized them as faces he once knew in our family. As for my grandma, who kept all her goodies in the basement, well, one night, my grandma, her ex, and everyone else were all in the kitchen in the double-wide house. Suddenly, Grandma needed to go into the basement to grab some onions. So Grandma and her ex went into the basement, and they both opened the old door. My grandma screamed, "There's someone in the basement," over and over again. The two of them ran up the stairs and shut it. My grandma even called the police. They then all heard heavy footsteps walking up the stairs and stopping right at the door. But none of them was brave enough to open the door. Soon the cops showed up, and my grandmother tells them what happened. The police go into the basement, and they searched for whoever it could have been, but they found no one down there. But my grandma didn't lay off. She swore to God that there was someone in that basement, and she wanted them to find them. The cops looked at my grandma like she was crazy and out of her mind. They told her, "Ma'am, there's no one down there. We searched left and right, but there's no one there. We're very sorry." Apparently, my grandma and my first aunt had talked about it after that incident. My grandmother told her that when they went down there for the onions, they'd opened the old door, and they both saw this really old man that was standing up against the wall. He then proceeded to stretch and extend both of his arms towards them, opening both of his hands, revealing 2 big bulb onions. She wasn't expecting anything like that, so she was terrified. But they later came to terms that it may have been great-great-grandpa, and he wasn't trying to hurt them. So yeah, a lot has happened over there in those homes. When my great-grandpa passed away, the strange part is, no one ever saw any of the spirits again. No more footsteps upstairs, no more figures in the barn rafters. It all stopped. It was as if they were waiting for him to join them. Ever since then, the double white house was torn down and a new one was built there, and the farmhouse was all redone on the inside. The 2 neighboring homes were sold to my grandma's nephew, who has since passed away. It was then sold to some of our random cousins. I just can't help but wonder if anything else has happened there since. Perhaps something that I don't know about. So you want to be an empath? From Alex19. Empathy is a link that connects all of humanity. Everyone has it. Having empathy, as quoted from the Oxford Dictionary, is when a person has the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It's basic psychology. Being an empath, on the other hand, is something different. People labeled as empaths have the ability to not only understand and share the feelings of other people, but actually feel the emotions of individuals or groups. For instance, places and events like funerals, concerts, or even simple conversations between 2 human beings give off a variety of different feelings and emotions. Empaths pick up most, if not all, of those emotions. But what if empaths could pick up on more than just human feelings and emotions? When people think of ghosts and ghouls, they think of spiritual energy. Words like auras and energies are often brought up when there are discussions about these sorts of things. Mediums and psychics come to mind, but empaths are another group who can pick up on those sorts of things. Empaths usually cannot see said spirits, but they can feel them. A spirit, whenever I sense them, usually feels like a jumble of emotions. Sometimes it feels like a pressure in your chest. There are a variety of different ways to sense them as an empath, but everyone is different, and not everyone feels or senses spirits in the same way. Throughout my life, I've felt quite a bit of energies and emotions. It's sometimes been hard to parse through all the emotions and determine when those are living beings feeling them, or those that reside across the veil. It makes it so much easier when I walk through a place that has seen death. For instance, walking through museum houses, I get to feel the energy from ages past. My story now begins a number of years ago in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was in college, determining housing for the up-and-coming school year. A friend and I were working on buying a small house on the outskirts of the campus. The campus resides in the oldest city in Michigan, with a majority of the buildings in and around the school and city having been built in the early 1900s and late 1800s. History was in everyone's backyard. In January, my friend and I bought a house and began to do the renovations. The previous owner had gutted the place, which truly created a whole mess of a time for us. Because of city codes and ordinances about how houses are supposed to be built for habitation, we couldn't move in, but we could begin to explore it. We learned that the house was built in 1910, and it could be traced to many different families who owned and walked its halls. Although small, the space was perfect for 2 bachelors, living the college lifestyle. We didn't have any neighbors on either side of us, so that made the house even more nice. It was the middle of January when things got weird. I was sitting in the middle of the campus dining hall one day when my friend approached me with the weirdest look on his face. From that very moment, I knew that something spooky was going on at the house on the block. Dude, there's something weird going on. I cocked my head as he said this and put my fork down to fully engage in something I thought would be interesting. He sat there, face screwed up in concentration, trying to think about how to best deliver the news. Well, I think the house is haunted. This really piqued my interest, as I'm a firm believer in the paranormal. Ever since learning about my empathic state, I found more and more interest and began forming ideas about what goes on after we pass through the other side. Oh, I answered back, excitement beginning to bubble up inside me. Yeah, I've witnessed and heard things in the house, he responded. At this point, I was thinking scientifically. Obviously, I was super excited. It's not every day that a person can say they have legitimate proof of a real, very dead paranormal being in your house. I gave a witty sort of smile. What happened exactly? What did you see? What did you hear? The other day, I was working on things in the kitchen when I heard someone knock on the front door, open the door, and walk right up the stairs. I then heard the water turn on in the bathroom. At this point, I could physically see the concern and confusion on his face. My friend, throughout our years together, was not one that enjoyed the supernatural. He wasn't the type that could just decide to watch a horror movie on a whim, unlike myself, who went on a literal horror movie binge for the first few years of college. I went upstairs to check on the bathroom, but no one was there, I swear. This is beginning to freak me out. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking about a settling house, an old door, actual physical reasons for all these seemingly spooky things. But here's where the scientific side of things comes in, something I was thinking about the entire time he talked. Mind you, I'm fully aware that all of the things that were heard and witnessed could be something completely natural. But throughout our time, I found that specific things seem less ordinary and more in the realm of the extraordinary. Let's start with the fact that there was no door. It was feasibly not possible for someone or something to open something that was not there. It had been removed 2 years back. And remember, there were no neighbors and the street was quiet. Plus, my friend was in the back part of the house, away from the street. And the walls were thick. Little could be heard through them. Second, the stairs needed someone to be on them to actually make a sound. In my 1.5 years of living there, I never once heard any settling in the stairs, or any part of the house for that matter. In tests conducted after these events, it was discovered that people needed to be walking up or down the stairs to get any form of sound from them. On top of that, as was previously stated, my friend was on the other side of the house, so he could have only heard something on the inside of the house. Thirdly, no one was outside at the time of the encounter, so that ruled out any human interaction. I'll say it again, there were no neighbors at the time. From that moment on, my entire friend group knew that our time spent at the house was going to be all about the paranormal. The house itself, even before knowing about our extra guests, had felt like there was someone else with us. We began to explore using a variety of techniques. The friends and I had already purchased a Ouija board from a local store, something we had already used a number of times. Not long after the initial encounter, my friend reported another unexplainable experience. It was another normal day around the lunch table, everyone joking around about the week's events. At one point, I brought up the house to my friend. With a nervous chuckle, he started another story about our ghostly friends. According to him, he and a few others were sitting in the living room chatting about the normal college things when someone shushed the entire group. They listened to the otherworldly laughter that followed and came from upstairs. They described it as a young girl giggling with a friend. Along with the footsteps and spectral laughing, it was enough to send them packing. This was during the middle of the day, when kids were not around, as everyone was at school. The following day, I decided to spend some time alone at the house. I wanted to see if I could witness any of the different things my friends were hearing. Quite unsurprisingly, stuff started to happen from the very moment I stepped foot in the house. It seemed as though the entire second floor was alive with activity. I didn't hear the laughter, but I did hear the footsteps. I decided to play a little game, the knock game. I shouted out the rules to those that were in the house, 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. I began to ask questions like, is there someone present? Or, did you die in this house? To those of you listening that don't believe in this game or think I might have associated settling floorboards with knocks, I have so much proof to point to the contrary. If the knocks were just floorboards, the knocks would be random and in multiple numbers. Instead, I received actual answers to my questions. Answers that made sense. The entire time, the feelings associated with the spiritual world were spiking. It felt as though the entire house was awash with many different entities. I attempted to focus on the energy coming from the spirit that was heard throughout the house. And to be completely frank, it was a beautiful feeling. I left that night feeling peace. A number of weeks later, my friends and I decided to do a full-on exploration of the house, including cameras, candles, and that wonderful Ouija board. Throughout the investigation, we witnessed moving shadows where we weren't, and heard movement when no one alive was moving. I even heard that little girl's laughter in one of the bedrooms of the house. During the investigation, just like the night I played the knocking game, I felt that presence in the house. It truly felt as though the girl who made her voice known was trying to be felt by us. In one of the main bedrooms, I was standing in a corner asking questions, when, much to my surprise, I felt a very cold breath of air float past me. That air seemed to surround me in a way that one might call a hug. That hug was also about the size of a little girl. It was a wonderful feeling. It's very hard to describe how it truly felt internally, but I can honestly say it was one of the most amazing experiences. After that, the entire group came into the main bedroom, and we started our Ouija board session. The Ouija board was something we were quite used to. As most warn, everyone has to take precaution before using a Ouija board. This includes candles, a small prayer beforehand, and if everything went wrong, some form of holy water or other spiritual object, both of which I had on my person. We started the session by creating a circle of candles around us, with the board in the center. As I had the most experience with the Ouija board, I was the leader of the session. I started with my short prayer, welcoming the friendly spirits into the circle and warning the not-so-friendly ones who might be there about the power of light. From there, we began to ask the board questions. As the session went on, we came up with a variety of different responses. When we asked the year the spirit died, we got the response 1912. 1912. When we asked for a name, we got the letter E. Not exactly what you might call mind-blowing, but they were still responses. After that night, classes and exams went on. The stresses of our lives were high. We didn't spend as much time at the house because everyone was too busy studying. All of that turned around in an instant. My friend and I were shopping at the local grocery store when a member of the Ouija board session called me. His call came as a huge shock. According to him, the responses we'd gotten were actually very significant. He had learned through a variety of different sources that in 1912, a young girl was murdered in the house by her own father. Years later, an older man died in the house. And the young girl's name began with the letter E. I was shocked. But there it was, the answer to our mysterious house. From there, we could at least understand who was in the house and why they were there. Although sad, we could at least provide some form of comfort to our extra spooky friends in the house. Summer came and went. Then it was finally fall, move-in time. This final part was truly the last time I felt someone else in the house with us. It was something that tied the entire saga up in a pretty bow and gave us a very satisfactory ending. To this day, my friend has not noted anything else strange going on inside the house, something he feels way better about. On the very first night staying there, I'd finished up my room and I was getting ready to go to bed. I set up a fan on the desk above my head. I turned off the light and lulled off into a contented sleep. I jolted awake at 3 a.m. Through my groggy eyes, I tried to figure out why I was awake. That's when I realized something was off. The fan was no longer on my desk. It was all the way across the room. I rubbed my eyes to ensure that I was awake. But, much to my chagrin, I was fully awake, not imagining anything. Suddenly, I felt a searing hot feeling in my back. Hot, searing anger. It was one of those feelings best described as a hot iron pressed up against your skin. I knew something was wrong. The anger that I was feeling pressed against me was something that I knew all too well. The message being,
I want you out. This is my home.
I began to silently talk it out. That was the only way I thought I could smooth things over. I began to talk to it about sharing the space and that we both could coexist in this house. I also talked about the light. I urged the spirit to move on and to be at peace. I assured it that if it didn't choose to move on, that I was always happy to share this space with it. After about 15 minutes of this silent talk, the angry feelings began to subside. Instead, they were replaced by the same peace that I often felt when simply sitting in the house in silence. It felt as though everything was going to be all right. When the anger was gone, I silently got up, put my fan back on my desk, and went back to bed. From there on out, all the feelings I'd felt before from the house were gone. Instead, the place was filled with living emotions and feelings. While I was sad to have lost a spiritual friend, I knew that whoever was there in the beginning had probably passed on to whatever lies across the veil, separating the living from the dead. If there was something to say to take away from this, it would be to always be aware of all the emotions and feelings that you might sense. Most times, those feelings and emotions you sense are probably from normal living human beings, but there are times when they may be from someone that isn't visible. When you pay attention to them, you never know when you might be able to help a lost soul, living or dead. Do not be afraid of these sorts of things. Tent Scraper from Edgelore. It was early October. I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the Manistee National Forest, about an hour south of Traverse City. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and I really needed to clear my head. I figured a few days alone in nature would do me some good. I arrived at my campsite off a dirt forest road late on a Friday afternoon. It was pretty remote. I hadn't seen any other cars for the last 5 miles or so. I set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked some dinner as the sun started to set. With the shorter fall days, it got dark early, about 7 p.m. I sat by the crackling fire, sipping a beer and trying to decompress. The night noises of the forest surrounded me. The hooting of an owl, the skittering of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional gust of October wind through the branches. I was starting to feel drowsy, and I was thinking about turning in my tent for the night. Suddenly, from somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the reach of my fire's light, I heard a sound I could not quite place. It was a sort of snuffling noise, like a large animal rooting around. Then a stick cracked, like something heavy had stepped on it. Whatever it was sounded big, much bigger than a raccoon or possum. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Instinctively, I reached for my hatchet. I'd brought it along to split firewood. My heart began to beat faster, and I called out, "Hello? Hello? Someone out there?" No response, just night sounds of the woods. I shook my head, thinking I was just freaking myself out. I figured it was best I head to bed before my imagination really got carried away. I kicked dirt over the remains of my fire, made sure it was fully extinguished, and crawled into my tent for the night. I read a few pages of my book by the light of my headlamp, but I couldn't really focus on it. I switched off the light and zipped myself up in my sleeping bag. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there listening to the fabric of the tent flapping lightly in the breeze. Time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more, I'm not sure. I never really fell fully asleep. Somewhere in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, I heard a sound that made my eyes snap open in the darkness. A long, low howl cut through the night. It sounded close, perhaps just beyond the tree line. My stomach clenched. I told myself it had to be a coyote or a wolf, but some primal instinct deep within me screamed this was no normal howl. The pitch was strange. It almost sounded more human than canine, and it just felt wrong somehow, unnatural. I reached out with a shaking hand and fumbled for my headlamp. I flicked it on and peered out the mesh window of my tent, scanning the tree line. I saw nothing but the trunks of trees fading into blackness. Then I heard something large crashing through the brush, moving fast, circling wide around my campsite from a distance. A feeling of raw animal terror gripped me. I was wide awake now, adrenaline spiking through my veins. I hastily grabbed my boots, not even bothering to lace them, and snatched my hatchet in one white-knuckled fist. I crouched there in my tent, my breath coming in panicked gasps, every sense strained. The thing in the forest had gone quiet now. I could almost convince myself I had only imagined it. But that's when I heard the heavy footfalls approaching. Bipedal steps, but far too heavy to be human. They came closer, just outside my tent. A shadow fell across the nylon wall, lit up by the silver glow of moonlight. The silhouette was vaguely human in shape, but elongated, distorted, with a canine profile. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I was frozen in pure primal horror. A clawed hand reached out, brushing the tent fabric. I saw the points of long dark nails catch the moonlight. Then, in a voice that was a gruff, guttural parody of human speech, something uttered 3 words that froze the blood in my veins.
I see you.
I just sat there, immobilized, quaking with terror, tears streaming down my face. At that moment, I was certain I was about to die, torn apart by this thing, this creature that could not possibly exist. An eternity passed, then the hand withdrew. The footsteps receded, heading back into the forest. The spell of terror was broken. I instantly leapt into action, adrenaline taking over. I burst from my tent, sprinting to my truck, still gripping my hatchet, not looking back. I fumbled my keys into the ignition and gunned the engine, tearing off down that dirt road. I sped all the way back to the highway, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that nightmarish patch of forest. Later on, I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was all just a bad dream, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I will never, ever go back to those woods, because now I know that the old stories are true. The Michigan Dogman is real, and it's out there somewhere in that forest. My grandpa's story for snowy nights, from Griller 1320. My grandfather was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. He had a way of commanding attention, of making even the most mundane stories feel like grand adventures. But there was one story he only ever told on the darkest of winter nights, when the snow was falling so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The story of his encounter with the Michigan Dogman. It was a tale he'd brought with him from his childhood home in the Upper Peninsula, a small logging town that hugged the edge of the Manistee National Forest. He was just a teenager then, working alongside his father in the timber camps. It was hard work, the kind that left your hands blistered and your back aching, but it was honest work. One particularly harsh winter, Grandpa was sent into town to pick up supplies. It was a long trek, made even longer by the deep snow and biting cold. He bundled up as best he could and set off, the snow crunching underneath his boots. The journey was uneventful at first, just a long white expanse of forest and snow. But as he walked, Grandpa started to feel uneasy. It was too quiet, he said, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing, the wind had stilled. It was like the world was waiting for something. That's when he heard it, a howl that pierced the silence like a knife. It was unlike anything he'd ever heard before or since. Not quite a wolf, not quite human, but something in between, something unnatural. Grandpa quickened his pace, but the howls seemed to follow him, growing louder, closer. He then broke into a run, his heart pounding against his ribs. That's when he saw it, stepping out from the trees like a nightmare made flesh. It was tall, he said, taller than any man, and walked upright on two legs. It was covered in fur, a thick, dark coat that bristled in the winter air. And its face, well, Grandpa always struggled to describe its face. Not quite canine, but not quite human either. A muzzle filled with teeth too sharp, eyes that glinted with a feral, knowing light. Grandpa did not wait to see what it would do. He ran like the devil himself was hot on his heels. He could hear the creature behind him, its heavy footfalls, its panting breaths. He ran until his lungs burned and his vision blurred, until he thought his heart would burst. Somehow, by some miracle, he made it to town. He stumbled into the general store, wild-eyed and gasping, collapsing on the floor. When he could speak, he told everyone around him what he'd seen, but they shook their heads, telling him he must have seen a wolf, maybe even a bear, nothing more. But Grandpa knew what he saw. He knew it in his bones, and he carried that knowledge with him, a secret burden for the rest of his life. Whenever he told me this story, it was like he was back there in those woods, the terror fresh as the day it happened. I could see it in his eyes, hear it in the tremble of his voice, and I believed him every word. Since then, I've heard other stories. Whispers and rumors of the Dogman stalking the forests of Michigan. And every time the snow falls heavy and the wind howls in the night, I think of my grandfather and that tale he carried with him. A tale of a monster that walks like a man, of a winter's night steeped in fear, of a brush with something that should not be. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.